I buried my brother 42 years ago. We called him Call, though his real name was Callum. He was 19 years old when the Greyhound bus he was riding crashed off the Coquihalla Highway during a January snowstorm back in 1983. The authorities told me that 17 passengers lost their lives that terrible night, and Callum was among them. I had to go to the morgue in Hope, British Columbia, to identify his body. I was only 23 at the time, and the unbearable task fell to me to inform our mother that her youngest child was gone forever. Last Tuesday, my phone rang at 2 o'clock in the morning. The caller identification showed an unfamiliar number, but I noticed the area code was from Vancouver. At 65 years old, I've learned through experience that middle-of-the-night phone calls rarely bring good news. Yet something compelled me to reach for the phone anyway. Perhaps it was the same intuition that used to wake me up when Callum had bad dreams as a child. When I answered, a voice on the other end asked if I was Brennan. My heart immediately started racing. The voice sounded rough and uncertain, like someone who hadn't spoken much in years. But beneath that coarseness, there was something that made my blood turn cold. I demanded to know who was calling. There was heavy, labored breathing on the line. Then the voice said it was Callum. I dropped the phone in shock. My hands trembled so violently that I could barely retrieve it. When I did, the line remained open and I could still hear breathing. I told the caller, my voice breaking, that this wasn't funny. I said that whoever they were playing such a sick joke was cruel. I stated that my brother had died 42 years ago. The voice acknowledged, knowing how much time had passed. He explained that he had just figured out his identity. He said he had discovered a newspaper clipping about the bus accident with a photograph of himself, and the caption identified the person as Callum Whitmore. He was asking me if that was who he really was. I couldn't catch my breath and the room seemed to spin around me. I managed to ask where he was located. He responded uncertainly that he didn't really know, mentioning a place people called the downtown Eastside. He told me he had been living there for a long time in a shelter on East Hastings Street. He explained that his memory was blank, that he couldn't recall anything before approximately 15 years ago when he woke up in a hospital. The hospital staff had told him he was found on the street without any identification, and he couldn't tell them his name. My thoughts were racing wildly. This couldn't possibly be real. I assumed it must be some kind of scam, perhaps someone who had stumbled across Callum's name and decided to torment me with it. To test him, I asked what he could remember. He said nothing was clear, just feelings and sensations. He mentioned sometimes dreaming about snow, about being extremely cold, about hearing people scream. He also said he sometimes dreamed about a house with a blue door, and someone who used to make pancakes with blueberries every Sunday. That's when the tears started flowing, hot and sudden, because I remembered that house perfectly. I remembered that blue door and our mother making those pancakes without fail every Sunday morning, and how Callum always ate twice as many as everyone else. I asked him, my voice barely above a whisper, what he looked like. He said he looked old, really old, and his face was weathered. He explained that he had lived a hard life on the streets for a long time, but when he found that newspaper photograph from the accident, even though it was 42 years old, he could see himself in that young face. He said they had the same eyes. I told him that Callum had a scar on his left forearm from falling off his bike at age 7, an injury that required 12 stitches. After a long pause, he said he had a scar on his left forearm, an old one that he never knew the origin of. At that moment, I broke down and started crying in a way I hadn't cried since the day we buried Callum. I demanded his address and told him I was coming to get him immediately. He tried to discourage me, saying he didn't think I should come. He said he probably wasn't the person I remembered, that he didn't remember being that person. He was just someone who had been living on the streets longer than he could recall. I firmly told him to give me his location right away. He provided the address of a shelter on East Hastings, which I wrote down with shaking hands. It was a 7-hour drive from Kelowna to Vancouver. I looked at the clock showing 2:15 in the morning and told him to stay put and not go anywhere. I said I would be there by noon at the latest. He quietly agreed and said he would wait. After the call ended, I sat in the darkness of my bedroom for maybe 30 seconds trying to process what had just happened. Then I was moving quickly, pulling on clothes and grabbing my wallet and keys. My wife Rosalind stirred in bed and asked what was wrong. I told her I had to go to Vancouver immediately. When she asked what had happened, I looked at this woman I'd been married to for 38 years and realized I didn't know how to explain it. I said I would explain later and left before she could ask more questions. The drive to Vancouver felt like the longest 7 hours of my life. I kept the radio off because I couldn't tolerate the noise. My mind churned with possibilities and impossibilities. Part of me remained convinced this was a cruel hoax, but another part of me, the part that had never fully accepted my little brother's death, was screaming that it was real. I thought about that day at the morgue. I was 23 years old when they pulled back the sheet to reveal a face that was badly beaten and swollen from the crash. The body had been in the cold for 12 hours before being recovered from the wreckage. There was a gash across the forehead and bruising everywhere, but I had looked at the shape of the face, the hair color, and the body's build, and I had confirmed that it was my brother, Callum Whitmore. What if I had been wrong? What if, in my state of shock and overwhelming grief, I had identified the wrong body? The possibility made me feel physically ill, because if that was true, then Callum had been alive all this time, suffering and alone, not knowing his own identity, while I had moved forward with my life. While I had married Rosalind, raised children, built a career, and celebrated birthdays and anniversaries. While our mother had died 10 years ago, still grieving for her youngest son. I reached Vancouver at 11:30 in the morning. The downtown Eastside was exactly as terrible as I had heard. There were boarded-up buildings, people slumped in doorways, and needles scattered on the sidewalks. I located the shelter on East Hastings, a low gray building. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the smell of industrial cleaner unsuccessfully attempted to mask the odor of too many unwashed bodies in too confined a space. A woman sitting behind a desk near the entrance looked up as I entered. When I explained I was looking for someone who had called me that morning to use the phone, she studied me for a moment before nodding slowly. She mentioned Callum, saying she remembered him being quite worked up. She called him a sweet guy who had been coming to the shelter on and off for about 8 years. She directed me to the common room. I walked toward the door she indicated, my heart pounding. The common room was a large space with mismatched furniture. About a dozen people were scattered around. Then I saw him sitting alone at a table near the window with his back to me. I could see gray hair pulled back in a ponytail. He wore a worn flannel shirt, and his shoulders were hunched. I approached him slowly. I said his name. When he turned around, the face that looked at me was nothing like the face I remembered. This man appeared weathered and worn, with deep lines around his eyes and mouth. There was a scar across his left cheek that hadn't been there before. He looked at least 70, not 61. But the eyes were exactly the same. Brown with flecks of gold, precisely like our father's eyes, exactly like Callum's eyes. He said my name and his voice cracked with emotion. I couldn't speak. He stood up slowly, moving as if his joints hurt. He was thinner than Callum had been and seemed shorter. But when he looked at me, there was something in his expression that took my breath away. He said I had come and that he wasn't sure I would. I demanded that he show me his left arm. He hesitated before rolling up his sleeve. There, running along his forearm, was a scar, old and faded, but unmistakable. About 4 inches long, right where Callum's scar had been. My knees went weak and I grabbed the edge of the table to steady myself. I said I needed to sit down. He pulled out a chair for me and I collapsed into it. I asked him to tell me about the bus crash and what he remembered. He said slowly that he didn't remember the crash itself, but he had recurring nightmares. In the nightmares, he was on a bus during a snowstorm. The driver was trying to slow down, but they were sliding, people were screaming, and it was so cold. Then just darkness for a long time. He explained that the next clear memory was waking up in a hospital, where a nurse told him he had been brought in from the streets. They said he had been beaten and robbed, but he didn't remember that either. He said they kept him for 3 days and ran tests, but couldn't find anything physically wrong beyond some old injuries. They mentioned head trauma, possibly from years earlier. I asked what year this was, and he said February 2010. My mind was racing because 2010 was 15 years after the crash. What had happened during those 15 years? I pressed him about what came before that period. He said sometimes he got flashes that didn't make sense. He remembered being cold frequently and living rough somewhere, possibly in mountains. He thought he remembered working manual labor, getting paid in cash. But everything was foggy. He looked down at his hands, which I noticed were scarred and heavily calloused. He said quietly that for a long time he didn't even try to remember. He just survived day to day. There were gaps in his memory even from the last 15 years. Doctors at free clinics had told him he might have some kind of dissociative disorder, probably from trauma. I asked when he started trying to remember. He said about 6 months ago, he met a volunteer woman at the shelter who was sorting old newspapers. She showed him one from January 1983. Something about that date made him feel strange. He reached into his pocket and carefully pulled out a yellowed, folded piece of newspaper, pushing it across the table to me. It was a front-page article about the bus crash. In a small photo grid of the victims was Callum's face, young and smiling. He said he looked at that picture for a long time and something clicked. He knew that face from somewhere deep inside. The name underneath, Callum Whitmore, felt right when he kept repeating it. He continued, explaining that he started looking for more information. At a nearby library, the librarian helped him search old records. He found the obituary and the list of surviving family members. My name was listed there along with an address in Kelowna. It took him 3 months to work up the courage to call. I said that I wasn't sure I could believe him, because if he was Callum, then I had identified the wrong body and told our mother the wrong son was dead. I told him that our mother was dead. She had died 10 years ago after spending 32 years thinking he was gone, and if he was really Callum, then she died without knowing he was alive. We both cried then, 2 old men in that shelter. Finally, I said we needed to do a DNA test. He agreed immediately. I found a place in downtown Vancouver that could have results within 48 hours. We went that afternoon. The test was straightforward with cheek swabs from both of us. As we left, I realized I couldn't just leave him at the shelter. I got us a hotel room. He took a long shower, and when he emerged, clean and shaved, I could see Callum's face more clearly. He asked me what he was like before, when he was Callum. The question hit me hard. I said he was good, really good, and kind. He was the kid who always brought home stray cats. He wanted to be a veterinarian. He was funny, and always made our mother laugh. He was brave. When our father left, he told me we would be okay, and that we would take care of Mom together. He whispered that he wished he could remember being that person. The phone rang 2 days later with the results. The probability of siblingship was 99.97%. We were biological brothers. I looked at him and said he was really Callum. We both cried, and I pulled him into a hug. He felt thin and fragile, but real and alive. We went to see Dr. Ingrid Castellano at the Free Clinic, a specialist in trauma cases. She examined him thoroughly and found extensive evidence of old trauma, healed fractures, and a depression in his skull. She explained her theory. Callum had survived the crash but was badly injured. In the chaos, he was thrown from the bus and ended up away from the main wreckage. The body I identified was another passenger of similar build. She believed someone found Callum and used him for labor in remote areas, operations that exploited workers without identification. Around 2010, 15 years after the crash, they either let him go or he escaped, and he ended up on Vancouver's streets. She said this would explain the gaps in his memory. Years of untreated head trauma and trauma responses caused his brain to shut down. I told him to come home with me to Kelowna. He said he didn't know how to be part of a family anymore. I said we would learn together. That was 3 months ago. It hasn't been easy. Callum has nightmares almost every night. He struggles with crowds and being inside for too long. He sees a therapist twice a week. But he's remembering things. Small details from our childhood. the taste of Mom's pancakes, the name of our dog. Last week he remembered a Christmas when he was 8. He told me yesterday that he's starting to feel like Callum. Not just someone who has his DNA, but actually becoming him again. Or maybe becoming someone new who includes him. My kids have met him. My 5-year-old grandson has decided that Callum is his best friend. Callum smiles more when the kids are around. Last week, Callum got a part-time job at a garden center. He's discovered he's good with plants. He comes home with dirt under his fingernails and stories about customers. He's learning to be a person again. And I'm learning too. I'm learning that grief doesn't work the way you think it does. I spent 42 years grieving my brother, and now he's here, but I still feel the loss of who he was. But I'm also grateful because he's alive. Against all odds, he survived. He asked me the other day if I ever blamed myself for identifying the wrong body. I told him honestly that I did, every single day. He told me not to, saying I was 23 and had just lost my brother, and I did the best I could. He replied that if I had looked more carefully, they might never have found him. At least this way he's here, alive, and has a brother who drove 7 hours in the middle of the night because a stranger said his name. I'm trying to forgive myself. Sometimes late at night I lie awake and think about all the years we lost. I think about Mom and how happy she would have been to know he was alive. But then I remind myself that the past is the past and we can't change it. All we can do is move forward. Last night we sat on the deck after dinner and Callum looked up at the stars. He asked if I thought Mom knew, wherever she was, if she knew he was alive. I said I thought she did, and that she had been watching over him this whole time, keeping him alive until he could find his way back. He smiled at that. He said he was glad I answered the phone. I told him I was too. Despite everything, the pain, the confusion, the grief that somehow still exists alongside the joy, I'm grateful because my brother came back from the dead. And that's a miracle I never thought I'd see. I learned that hope isn't foolish even when it seems impossible. I learned that people are more resilient than we give them credit for. I learned that family isn't just about shared memories, but about choosing to show up day after day, even when it's hard. And I learned that it's never too late for a second chance. Callum's still finding himself. He may never remember everything. He may always carry the scars of those lost years. But he's here. He's alive. And he's home. And that's enough. That's more than enough. That's everything.